Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Thomas Jefferson, and the focus is the war at home. The year is 1776. Independence has been declared. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration has been embraced, adopted, signed. But to go into effect, the Americans were going to still need to win the war, the battle against the British, which had been going on already for more than a year. For the next 7 years, that battle would still hang in the balance. The fighting would continue until late 1881, and then a couple of more years before the peace treaty was finally signed. And during this period from 76 to 83, those 7 years, Thomas Jefferson did virtually nothing to advance the cause of American independence. I'll say that again. During this 7-year period, during the war, after the Declaration has been adopted, Thomas Jefferson did virtually nothing to advance the cause of American independence. Now, 15 of the 56 signers of the Declaration went on to fight in the war, put on the uniform and work for General Washington to fight for the freedom of their country. Another 25 continued to serve in Congress. Some served in diplomatic roles. There were plenty of signers who continued to engage at the national level. Thomas Jefferson was not one of them. Shortly after his declaration was adopted, he returned home to Monticello. He focused on his farm, his family, building his home, his personal interests, science, all kinds of interesting things. But despite numerous entreaties from some prominent founding fathers like John Adams, George Washington, who both reached out personally to Jefferson, he refused to engage at the national level. At one point, he cited, quote, circumstances very peculiar in the situation of my family as the reason that he couldn't re-engage, again, at that national level. And by this, he meant the health of his wife, Martha. Martha was often ill, and most of those were related to her pregnancies, and she was pregnant just about every year that she was married to Thomas Jefferson over that 10-year period. And she was ill during the pregnancies, and sometimes the post-pregnancy recovery was even worse, would take weeks or even months at a time, and this was one of the main reasons that Jefferson gave for having to remain at home. Now, of course, many other founding fathers also had domestic situations that required a lot of personal attention, and they were able to sort of do both at the same time. But Jefferson made his call that during the war, he was going to basically remain at his mountaintop in Northern Virginia. Now, Jefferson did engage at the state level during the Revolutionary War. He found when he left Congress in 1776 that it was in the persuasion that our whole code, the Virginia Code, must be reviewed, adapted to our Republican form of government, and now that we had no negatives of councils, governors, and kings to restrain us from doing right, that it should be corrected in all its parts, with a single eye to reason and the good of those for whose government it was framed. And Jefferson did pour some energy into these efforts, and he had some notable accomplishments. Now, even here, his attendance was very spotty. In fact, at a couple of different points, not once but twice, the Sergeant at Arms, on behalf of the House of Delegates, had to detain Jefferson and fine him for his numerous absences. So he did work in this area and had accomplishments, but again, full engagement? Not really, because he spent most of his time with his family and farm at Monticello. Let's talk about some of the things, though, that he pursued. One of the things that had been a source of angst for Jefferson, really most of his life, was this generational passing of wealth from one generation to the next, locking in the aristocracy, not based on good works or personal skills, but simply based on birth, which Jefferson just thought was unfair. He couldn't stand and he wanted to stop. But there were legal elements in place in Virginia and other states that were actually keeping it going by law. And two of these were called Entail and Primogeniture. These two combined required estate owners to pass their estates in their entirety to a single heir, typically the oldest son. And that way it would stay as a wealthy estate in aggregate, in full, and be able to continue to persist in the aristocratic realm really for time immemorial. Well, Jefferson again thought this was not contrary to what was good for the community and something that he wanted to get rid of. He said early on that to annul this privilege of entail and primogeniture, and instead of an aristocracy of wealth, of more harm and danger than benefit, to a society to make an opening for the aristocracy of virtue and talent, which nature has wisely provided for the direction of the interests of society and scattered with equal hand through all its conditions, was deemed essential to a well-ordered republic. This was actually some of the birth of the American dream, is that we're not going to have these locked-in caste system where aristocrats continue to hold power from generation to generation along with their wealth, but that anybody could have the ability to rise up through their own skills, their own hard work, and achieve an elite status based on something they've earned as opposed to something that they were born into. And Jefferson, in this case, is successful. Entail and Primogeniture are taken off the books as the Code of Virginia is revisited. Jefferson also advocated heavily for public education as a necessity for a well-informed, qualified electorate in a democratic republic. If you're going to give people the vote, they have to be informed about what they're voting about, and that required an education. He actually advocated for public funds to be given to the impoverished so that they could join the ranks of the educated and contribute in this democratic republic. Jefferson's greatest triumph here in this period was in the area of religious freedom. And we say those words very specifically, religious freedom and not religious toleration. There had been some movement in Virginia and elsewhere to be more tolerant of other religions. Jefferson, that wasn't enough. He wanted religious freedom, where people could choose whichever religion they wanted to join and whatever beliefs they wanted to have, including the right to have no beliefs and no religion at all, which was very much frowned upon at the time. The Anglican Church was deeply embedded in both the government and the society within the state of Virginia, and there was a lot of resistance to this idea of religious freedom, including the freedom to not believe in anything or any religion at all. Jefferson persisted, and he had a partner in crime in this one, a young James Madison, who they had met and were working together in the House of Delegates, so that when Jefferson actually goes off on his first diplomatic mission abroad, Jefferson continues to push for the Statute of Religious Freedom, which was finally passed in 1786. At the time, Jefferson sent a note of congratulations to Madison, and he wrote, "It is honorable for us to have produced the first legislature who had the courage to declare that the reason of man may be trusted with the formation of his own opinions." Jefferson was so proud of this that he already had 2/3 of his epitaph written. He didn't know it yet, but two of the items that he would later in life decide would go on his epitaph, Declaration of Independence and the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia. There would be a third item that would go on that epitaph as well, but that would not occur for another 4 decades. And we'll cover that in a different episode. Now, in June of 1779, Jefferson did answer the call to lead his state. So he's not engaging at the national level while the war is going on, but he does agree to become the governor of Virginia. He serves 2 one-year terms, and they are basically a disaster. Jefferson has a very laissez-faire approach to governance, and while he's doing that, the war is coming to his state, and he's doing virtually nothing to stop it. General Washington and the British were face-to-face to each other in New York, and so the British decided to say, well, we'll keep a contingent here, but then we're going to go attack in the South. And they set their sights on the Carolinas and on Virginia. General Charles Cornwallis and General Benedict Arnold. Yes, that Benedict Arnold, the former colonial general who became a traitor and joined the British. They're running roughshod throughout the state of Virginia, and Jefferson's Virginia is doing nothing to stop them. He's done nothing to form a militia, put in defensive works, to actually have any signal kinds of communications to warn people as to where the British were. All of the kinds of infrastructure that you would hope might be in place to help keep his state safe. Jefferson does none of this. So what happens? The government itself is actually chased around the state as the British burn the Capitol. They actually get close to Jefferson's home in Charlottesville, where the government is. The British are on their heels. They scatter to the winds. Jefferson rides up to his mountaintop at Monticello. He sends his family on his way, collects his state papers. In the middle of the night, just a few minutes in front of the British, he gets on his horse and rides away, and he at least is safe. This is how he ends his governorship, which actually expired the night before his ride into the night. Now, Jefferson was really criticized, in fact, almost given a label of a coward who was racing off in the middle of the night to escape the British. Now, this is frankly completely unfair. I mean, what else was he to do? He had state papers, he was the governor, getting captured wasn't much of an option. The fact is, he was a great horseman, he knew the area really well. In fact, it took some bravery to go out there and in the middle of the night race away at full speed. This was not a cowardly act, this was a necessity. But the real issue wasn't what Jefferson did on that night of his escape. It's all the things he didn't do leading up to that moment that others in Virginia were really quite concerned about. And so after Jefferson left office, there was a call for an investigation on his performance as governor. And Jefferson, who hated a confrontation, actually in this case decides he's going to stand up for himself. He reruns to get himself into the House of Delegates, and he is ready to defend himself against this inquisition, as he sees it, against his performance and his character. Well, fortunately, all of this kind of goes by the wayside when the Americans defeat the British at Yorktown in October of 1781. The fighting in the war effectively comes to an end, and nobody wants to spend a lot of time bashing over the head the guy who had written the Declaration of Independence for his performance as governor. And so the investigation kind of dwindles off to the side, and Jefferson is exonerated, but he's also exhausted. He's bitter by the whole experience, and he wants nothing to do with public service, frankly, ever again. Well, then his circumstances change. While the peace negotiations are continuing in Europe, Martha, his wife, is pregnant again, gives birth to Lucy in May 1782. Once again, she is struggling to recover, and this time she does not recover. And Martha Jefferson dies 4 months later in 1782, and Jefferson is inconsolable. He spends 3 weeks in his room, never leaves his room, and 6 months of deep mourning as his whole personal life had just been shattered by the loss of his wife. Well, the rest of the world continues to start coming, and Jefferson actually starts to think maybe he'll answer the call. Perhaps public service would help him out of his doldrums. And even though he didn't engage at all in the national effort throughout the course of the war, maybe there's a role he could play to get his spirits moving again in the national scene now that the war is over and they're moving in this new direction. And Jefferson is now ready to re-engage, but that is the story for another day. And that is Thomas Jefferson and the War at Home, from the life of Thomas Jefferson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.